Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I am the CEO of PetroNerds and host of the PetroNerds podcast, and I'm delighted to do this podcast today. This is a 4th of July special, so I'm going to keep this. I'm going to keep this podcast short and sweet, and I'm going to try to do kind of a global roundup of everything happening in the world and the U.S., which there's a lot, but we'll try to keep this to around 20 minutes as a 4th of July special. Today is July 1st, 2025. We are seeing oil prices at $65.66 for WTI right now. We're looking at Brent at $67.34. Henry Hub is sitting at $3.40. Dutch TTF, European natural gas prices, dollars per MMBTU, are $11.35. And we're looking at the 10-year yield, which we're going to talk about a little bit with the Fed. We're looking at the 10-year yield at 4.257%. So we have seen, pressure, as we've talked about previously, where when you're notching up to that 4.5%, that's when people start getting worried about 5%. And we're really not seeing that. We're seeing some alleviation of that. One, it is very interesting because what we're seeing today is is the market is basically thinking that this big beautiful bill, the BBB, which we'll also talk about, is going to get passed. It passed the Senate last night, and so everyone's thinking, hey, this is going to get passed. And that's interesting because for all the commentary and the everybody getting nervous about the increased spending and increasing the deficit, we're not seeing that seeing that actually in yields. And so there's a number of things happening there with what's going on with the dollar, what's going on with the 10-year yield. And then you're looking at the 30-year mortgage because you still have those 10-year yield north of 4%. You're looking at 30-year mortgage at 6.8% right now. So not seeing a whole lot of reprieve there. Now, those are all relevant because I still think inflation is a big story that needs to be talked about. And that's important because we are seeing continual pressure from the president of the United States, Trump, talking about Jerome Powell and the need to lower interest rates. And we just had an article today that dropped on CNBC, literally just today, that says that Powell has now come out publicly and said that they would have lowered interest rates had it not been for tariffs. So there's a lot of interesting things going on there, and implications for the economy, and for the industry. So with regards to the industry, this is a 4th of July special. I think what's kind of missing, if I was to just say, if I was sitting on a panel or I was doing a keynote address, the things I would say right now, or the biggest things right now, is that geopolitics, right? $65.66. We're okay. We've got some okay footing right now in oil. Obviously, we are lower than, I always go back to this December when we were about $69 a barrel, and where I think the market was sort of $69, $70 a barrel. The market was sort of pricing in reality, right? It was sort of like the economy's not ripping, but we have plenty of supply and demand. And so it's $65.66, only weeks. It's July 1st, right? We're weeks and, less than 2 weeks off the back of the strikes of the U.S. government on Iran, on their nuclear facilities. July 12th was the day that the evening of July 12th was when Israel struck Iran and started targeting their missile and defense capacities and everything. And then we had multiple days of action and activity. So we're only 2 weeks from that, right? That was June 12th, right? So it's now July 1st. So it's 2 weeks ago this all happened, and that's when we saw oil prices spike up to above $75 a barrel. So I think what I'm hearing and what I heard on the back of this, and I've talked about this, a little bit in when I've talked with live streams with Jason Isaac with American Energy Institute. We've discussed this, and this will be in future podcasts. But I think we're not paying enough attention to or talking enough about oil and the pricing dynamics and supply and demand. And so right now, one of the things that led to prices going up, obviously, was that oil prices were oversold before this actual conflict. So you had that. And then you had the oil prices being oversold. Everybody had their finger on the sell button. And so it was these recession worries that everyone was concerned about. And so you had just this oversold momentum on oil. So then you had to have a reversal in that trade when you obviously have conflict in the Middle East. There had to be a reverse on that. Obviously, people have been bitten from that. But more importantly, what the heck was going on with supply and demand? And so the reality is that, the market was really well supplied. And actually, probably what happened was that Iran increased output during those weeks and maybe even in the run up to that. So we probably had more oil on the water, probably in the Middle East or on the market. And that helped also when the ceasefire happened and when volatility decreased and people are less concerned about war. Obviously, prices are coming down, but part of that reason is that they are coming down because we have a lot of oil on the water and oil on the market. So I think you saw this increased output certainly from Iran. there's some very interesting stuff going on there, because it was only about a week ago, I think Trump actually put out the tweet that said, Iran can sell barrels to China. And that's caused confusion within the administration. It's caused confusion within the market, because these Iranian barrels are sanctioned. And so Chris Wright, I've seen him on TV talking a little bit about this. And essentially he's talked about, the world being pretty well supplied because the US is the largest producer in the world. And that we can, we would have had much higher prices had we not had US oil production. He's absolutely right. At 13.5 million barrels a day of oil production in the US, we definitely have helped the market weather a lot of this volatility that in previous years we would have seen much higher prices and price spikes. But that being said, when Trump tweets this and says that China can buy this, well, this crude is sanctioned, but Iran has worked around these sanctions because they basically have these shadow vessels, and both Iran and Russia have worked really well, have done a good job on defense of themselves in terms of moving around the shadow vessel fleet. Iran moves crude to Malaysia, it goes into different ships. And so once you move this stuff around a lot, it's hard to actually track it. We could track it, we just need to enforce it. And clearly we are not doing that. So you have, at the time of this, when this war broke out, or this June 12th, you have at least 3.5 million barrels a day that Iran's producing, maybe 3.6, maybe 3.7 million barrels a day that they're producing. And so, everyone estimates that China's getting 1.5 million barrels a day. I think it's probably more. I think it's probably close to 2 million barrels a day. And that's because, how much is Iran actually consuming? Like, they do not have a rip roaring economy. They're not making a lot of things. So I don't see them consuming, 2 million barrels a day and change of crude oil. I think it's significantly less than that, which means everything that they're not consuming, and they're producing a crap ton of oil, and they're increasing it incrementally every month, that's going to China, right? And so the things that are happening in the market is that, we were oversold, but we're not thinking about why we're oversold. So, we're oversold because we're not growing demand. And so US demand looks okay right now. Like, we've got summer months, we've got summer driving, Cushing inventories were down. And so you're hearing kind of a conflicting narrative in the market, and really bad coverage, I think, on oil within the stock market. And people are saying, okay, well, Cushing inventories are down, but we're at $65 a barrel, and OPEC this weekend in a couple days is going to increase output. Well, all these things can be true, right? You can have conflict in the Middle East, you can have Iran adding barrels, you can have oil prices getting sold off that, and you can still have Cushing inventories draw down. You can have all these things being true, because that means, I mean, we do increase driving in the summer months. I drive a lot in the summer. I don't drive nearly as much during the rest of the year, because the roads are great, and I can go up to Wyoming, and I can go up to Colorado. So I'm not the only one that drives more in the summertime. So you have increased driving within the summer, so your gasoline demand is pretty okay. Ironically, I mean, not ironically, but we don't actually see this materially in the data, where we're, going to 21 million barrels a day of demand instead of 20 million barrels a day, right? It's still hanging in there. So you do see increased driving. You can have an impact on inventories, but that doesn't mean that we don't have plenty of global supply in the market. And so, that is important. I also heard from shortly, or during this conflict and shortly after it, when oil prices came down, I heard folks like Dan Pickering. He was on I believe it was CNBC, or maybe it was Bloomberg, but it was very late. I think it was probably CNBC. It was midnight, and he'd come on, and they were asking about what was going on with Iran and supply. And he said something like, Iran had 3 million barrels a day of production. And, I don't know if he misspoke, but if that's the case, like, if he's thinking actually 3 million barrels a day, a few 100,000 barrels a day is a lot in this market. And so I think we have to be careful with that a little bit, is if certain folks are thinking it's 3.3 or 3 million barrels a day, and they're actually producing 3.6 or 3.7 million barrels a day, it's 700,000 barrels a day that the market has to account for. And so that's really important. Also, and I hear this, Arjun Maradi was on TV, and he's, a board member of ConocoPhillips, a board member of Liberty, but he's also, he works with Veriton and formerly Goldman Sachs. And so he's been on TV a couple of times when there's been conflict and oil prices and everything. And so he was on CNBC around the same time. And so he reiterated something of a Veriton viewpoint, that they don't believe that OPEC is that we don't have that much spare capacity. And so I think that's being challenged a bit. I mean, obviously it's $66 or $65.66 ahead of OPEC increasing output. But also right after 2 weeks after this, on the heels of this conflict, the world seems to be well supplied, has plenty of spare capacity within OPEC, and that the demand growth is not there. So there's three major factors I don't hear enough talking about. So we have the stock market kind of ripping on the back of, not having this war and, going to have this big, beautiful bill passed and a number of things that the stock market is wanting to go higher and things are great. And I don't think you can have oil prices lower and the stock market higher and be confident in the economy, because that means that, the reason oil prices are not higher because you don't have that demand growth. You have kind of sluggish global economic growth. And I don't think the stock market or earnings are priced for that. Now, that doesn't mean the stock market's not going to continue to go higher, because there's a lot of money around the world kind of sloshing and needing to find a home. And so it's going to go into the stock market. And importantly, what I've heard a lot lately, and I listen to Bloomberg Surveillance and all kinds of podcasts. What I hear a lot lately is this in the last several weeks, and particularly when we had Trump tariffs beginning in April, was that the reversal of the U.S. exceptionalism is fading. And I'm wearing a red shirt. I've got my flag earrings on. This is the Fourth of July special. I really think that it's a pretty ridiculous notion, especially if you know about the U.S. Treasury market or about the U.S. market, the stock market. Like, the size of Apple is larger than the German stock market, right? So you can't actually just go to Europe as an alternative investment because it's not that deep or liquid. And so the US stock market is much bigger. And so that's why it's going to attract that. And we have just greater transparency. And so when you think of US treasuries it's a deep and liquid and very transparent market. And so that's naturally, yes, like on the fringe, maybe you lose some money there on US treasuries, but on the whole, are you going to de-dollarize? Absolutely not. Because when there is during this conflict in the Middle East, we actually saw a bid up on the dollar. And that's because everyone goes to the safe haven trade. Even though we were part of this conflict, right? We were actually bombing Iran, we still had a bid up on the dollar. And then we saw that pull back. And now, everyone's talking about the worst dollar trade in basically half a century has basically happened in this last quarter or so, that the dollar is down. Well, so the dollar's down for a number of different reasons, and there's a gazillion reasons for that. But I think when we think about U.S. exceptionalism and can it come back and where it's at, I still think, folks, we have a very deep and liquid treasury market. We have a very deep and liquid stock market, and the dollar is still the dominant currency. So you do have a lot of countries that are concerned about debt and deficits and inflation, and that's where people pull out a little bit. So I am concerned more about inflation than I think others are. And so I'm going to pivot here a little bit. We're going to come back to oil in just a second and round this out, and talking about global oil supply and Iran. But I want to pivot a little bit to this inflation piece, because this was cornerstone to what was going on within this conflict of this major conflict that started on June 12th. Is that, if we had a price spike in oil, the implications to the U.S. economy and the global economy are massive, because the consumer is simply not that healthy. And I think I heard these data points today on CNBC, with Kelly Evans was talking at lunch today, and she's explaining that, hey, we have a average auto payment. The average auto payment people have right now on autos is over $700 a month, with many of them well above $1,000 a month. So that's, yes, interest rates are high, but that's also these cost of these vehicles is very high. And so you think about your average auto payment. Now think about your average utility bill. And right now we're seeing it's 60%, 60%, it costs 60% more now to own a home than it did in 2019 and 2020. And that is because we've had massive inflation, and then inflation not just on housing and housing prices, but also on electricity bills and utilities. And so it's extremely important to think about this, because my taxes have gone up massively in Denver. My tax bill on my house is now nearly a third of my mortgage, because we had a massive tax increase in 2022, and we just had another serious one increase just this past month. And so, everybody's trying to get more from less, right? They're just trying to bid this up. And so these taxes are increasing. My utility bill's gone up threefold since COVID. So it costs more to own a home now than it did before. And so if you think about that, just home ownership and heating and cooling your home, and then your car, there's not much room left for spending. And so that's where we think about, if we have a spike in oil prices, what that does to the consumer. Well, lowering oil prices is a direct benefit to them, right? Because they feel a little bit of reprieve. But a spike in oil prices is what they're going to feel it weeks down the road, and they're going to feel that price spike, and that's not going to feel very good. They're going to have less money to spend. So there are direct consequences to the economy, and they don't necessarily materialize in a demand drop, right? But they can actually impact the ability for demand to grow, or healthy demand, right? And so I think when you're thinking about $65.66 or $65 a barrel, that's an okay price for oil. It's not amazing for the oil and gas industry, but it's not horrible either. And I think if we stabilize at 65, you're not going to see rigs continue to tank, as the way people have projected and everyone had projected, especially with the Diamondback letter with Diamondback taking off rigs and frac fleets. Now, I am going to be having Ron Gusick, the CEO of Liberty Energy. He was formerly the president. Now he's the CEO. He's going to be on the podcast. We're recording this tomorrow. So we're going to talk a lot about the frac industry, the service sector. So we'll be diving into that. And we have a ton of stuff in the queue. The podcast that I did when I was in Austin with Matt Gallagher, the CEO of Green Lake, and Bud Brigham, who's also been in the news in the Wall Street Journal, that we're going to, that podcast will drop soon. There's just a lot in the queue, very, very rich, dense podcast. So you have a lot to look forward to, folks. And all those provide a little more color and context of the industry. Okay, so with this inflation and the Fed, we have seen the Fed basically saying they're kind of pausing or holding off, and they have been since essentially last September. So last year they did a 50 basis point rate cut, and they did two subsequent 25 basis points. So they dropped a whole percentage point in rate cuts, and then they stopped. And so what we're seeing, and very interestingly enough, and that's partly why yields are up, or not up, yields, the 10-year yield is holding up, is because the jobs data does not look that bad. And so, what the Fed was saying last fall, when they did this massive, these big rate cuts, is that they were getting ahead of rising unemployment. And we didn't have that rising unemployment materialize. And so I'm not saying the economy is great. Under the hood, I think employment is really messy. You are seeing a lot of folks having trouble getting to a 40-hour work week, right? You're having a lot of companies that actually don't pay people full-time wages because they don't want to pay all the benefits, because the taxes and the fees and the expenses are so dang high. So you have that. And so you have a lot of people with multiple jobs just trying to get 40 hours a week. And so if you look at the average hourly work week on the Bureau of Labor Statistics or other sites, you will see it continually sort of on this downward trajectory. That's a massive problem. And so I think under the hood, we have some problems. I do think that, the reason we're partly seeing jobs hold up, and every time we get a new jobs report, and that's partly what's going on now with yields, is that, if we have a decent jobs report, unless unemployment really ratchets up, then that's when then we're going to see the Fed cut rates. And so then the stock market wants to rally. Again, same with oil prices. You're rallying for the wrong reasons. If we have rising unemployment and we're getting to that recessionary territory, you're seeing yields go down. So you're seeing interest rates go down. So you think that's better for businesses to borrow. The problem is some shoe or some breakage has to really drop to cool off inflation. And I am concerned that if we drop interest rates now, we are not going to see inflation cool off. In fact, we're going to see it go up, because money is always chasing yield. And so you're going to have tons of money that goes into the stock market chasing yield. That's going to bid stuff up. And then think about housing. We have not seen housing prices drop significantly. In fact, we're at over $500,000 on a medium average home price. And your average median income is $100,000. So you're at a 1-to-5 ratio. And typically that used to be a 3-to-1, where your average home was 300,000 and your median income, or 3-to-1. Now it's 5-to-1. Home ownership is now unaffordable and unattainable for many, many people. Now, that doesn't mean you have to own a home, but it's just a serious factor in thinking about this, of like, we have not seen any cooling off in housing prices, right? Maybe rental incomes are going to come down a little bit, or there's at least not pressure to the upside, because you have so much build out of apartments, and that can eventually start weighing on construction jobs, which I think we're starting to see some pressure there that hasn't materialized again in the data. However, also going on in unemployment, we have an immigration stop. Basically, you do not have the illegal immigration that you had under the previous administration, where you had tens of thousands of people coming in every month. And so when you have that much immigration, which we did, we do have inflation, right? You just pressure services. You have more people in the country, more people needing housing, and more people buying food. And so part of this big, beautiful bill you did see was taking SNAP or food stamps away from illegal immigrants. So if you're not a taxpayer or you're a citizen, you're not eligible for that program. And so we increased food stamps under the Biden administration, but it 3x'd. So it went up massively. It came down a little bit, but food stamps went up significantly. That pressured food inflation. And I've said this before, and it's not that I am not attuned to people needing food and absolutely the need for that program, but you cannot not to expect to have food inflation when you 3x something like that, and that you just do it overnight and then everyone has food stamps. So that's a significant thing. And so when we think about, though, immigration unemployment, that's material, right? Because if we have less illegal immigrants or less people coming into the country and taking these, they could be construction jobs, they could be lower end jobs that, yes, many people don't want to take, but it means that those folks are out of the country or being pushed out or not coming in. And it means that other folks, that the unemployment figure may not rise, because you have a lot of US citizens taking those jobs. Now, they may not be paying well, and they may be what's contributing to that average hourly work week declining and the fact that people have to have multiple jobs to get to 40 hours. But the point is that it could be a component that's keeping a lid on the rising unemployment, keeping a lid on, people do have jobs. They might not be amazing and they may not be combating inflation perfectly necessarily, but they're hanging in there. And I think that's what generally what you're seeing is the economy sort of hanging in there, the consumers hanging in there. And so that's just important to think about because that really does matter for oil prices. And I think that's partly why we're seeing oil prices at, $65 a barrel. Everything's hanging in there, right? You don't have demand cratering, but you have plenty of supply on the market and you don't have demand growth. And so that's a good point here to just pivot a little bit and talk about oil supply and oil demand in China and the global economy. We continue to see tons of headlines. If you're watching the Asia Open or you're watching the evening stock market, you continue to see tons of headlines that China is looking to stimulate, that they're looking to work with the consumer, and that you're going to see increased spending. We have never seen that materialize since the zero COVID lockdowns were put in place and then removed, and everyone was very bullish on China. We have not seen that materialize. So we're just not seeing that growth in China. And importantly, with China, I think what you have to realize is when we're thinking about this conflict in Iran and we're thinking about what's actually going on with supply and demand and this oil price spike and oil comes back down, what we're realizing is that so when we don't have a geopolitical conflict and we take off this geopolitical risk premium from oil prices, so we're hanging at $65 a barrel, what we realize is that we kind of have squishiness in demand a little bit. And we have squishiness actually in the data. And that is because China imports probably 2 million barrels a day from Iran. They import over 2 million barrels a day from Saudi. They import over 2 million barrels a day from Russia. So half of their imports are coming from 3 countries, right? And the rest of their imports are coming from a myriad of other countries, several in the Middle East as well. So they're importing about 11 to 12 million barrels per day every day. And so on paper, their demand is 17 million barrels a day. We know that they're probably actually consuming more like 15 million barrels a day. And so they produce about 4.5 million barrels per day. They keep that production very, very steady. And so all the stuff on top of what they use is stockpiled. And so if you're stockpiling at least 1 to 2 million barrels a day, the data gets a little squishy because when we have a conflict in the Middle East, China can just not buy that Iranian crude, right? They don't actually need it. They're just not going to stockpile for a couple of weeks, maybe. And so that means that they're okay. And so you're not seeing a material impact to the economy or anything, but also means that stockpiling that they're doing is kind of clouding the market. And so that's why I think we get some missing data, some kind of squishy numbers. And that's also why people really look to the US. And so I say this with treasury yields, I say this with treasuries, I say this with US crude. We are the most transparent nation in the world, right? People can see our data. And so you can overtrade on our data because the US consumes about 20 million barrels a day of product supply. That's refined product that also includes propane and other natural gas liquids. But particularly you can see gasoline demand, which hangs around, just under 9 million barrels per day, and diesel demand and jet fuel demand. And so you can see this very clearly in the US, so folks can trade off this. And we also have very transparent and clear production data. And so the latest production data out of the US at the end of April, we're still at 13.5 million barrels per day. We've got Texas producing nearly 5.8 million barrels per day. And so we have this really, strength in just output. So for all the talk of lower prices, and again, this is April, so we could see that production come off as obviously rigs are coming off. We're going to see May production and probably June production backslide. But we would have to see a continuing material decline in both the rig count and the frac fleet and the actual completions, the wells brought online. I'm talking material decline to actually lower output significantly. So I just concluded a report that is going to be published with the Peterson G Foundation. And we looked at this is a think tank in Washington that looks at the fiscal side. And so we did this to think about, could the U.S. grow the 3 million barrel of oil equivalent or the 3 million barrels a day that Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, has said that they would like to grow, said that the U.S. administration would like to grow. And importantly, this has meaningful implications, right, for the actual economy, for what we could, the revenue that we would contribute. So producing oil and gas in the U.S. enables jobs. It keeps this money at home that we're not purchasing this crude oil from folks abroad. I mean, there's a myriad of knock-on benefits financially to the United States of America in keeping this money at home domestically, energy security, you name it. But the question of, could we grow and what that would do, that's meaningful. And so I did this forecast and I kept it pretty conservative. So this data will be released shortly, but I kept the forecast pretty conservative. And the interesting thing about this is that you can grow production, to 1 million barrels a day within 5 years relatively easily, right? You don't have to add too many more wells or completions each month to actually get to that 1 million barrel a day growth in 5 years. if you add, if we had pretty high natural gas prices, or let's say we had $450 of natural gas prices, I think you would start really growing natural gas production as well. So you can see easily if you're talking about BOE, or barrel of oil equivalent, you can grow that to 3 million barrel of oil equivalent relatively easily when you're including gas in that. So that's possible. That is actually doable within 5 years pretty easily. The question, though, on I thought was very interesting is that I actually tanked oil prices and I took completions way down. And so, really interesting to actually really, really drop oil output in the US, going from 13.5 million barrels a day to say, taking that down to 12. You have to materially drop completions. Wells brought online. And I'm not talking a little bit. I'm talking, if you have them, if you took them in half of what there are now of the wells we're bringing online each month, you would still, in 5 years, you would still be producing around 10 million barrels per day. That's incredible. That means that, so you're taking completions down to a fraction of what they are now, at less than half, and you would still be one of the largest, if not the largest producer of oil in the entire world. So, and definitely the largest gas producer. So that's just really important. I think put that in your back pocket and think about that when people are talking about peak shale and this narrative around peak shale. Just think about that a little bit. Okay, so before we conclude this 4th of July PetroNerds podcast special, episode 135, I do want to talk a little bit about this big, beautiful bill and where it's at. It's a complete mess right now. I have tried to go through both versions, the over 1,000-page version from the House that passed last month, and then the it's 940 pages to pass the Senate. But literally right now, so late last night, I think J.D. Vance, as the vice president of the United States, he's the tiebreaker for the Senate. So he broke the tie and the gridlock within the Senate. So they passed it. And now the stock market is pricing in an assumption that it's going to get passed, right? That this is going to get passed. And really the single biggest important thing within this bill for the Trump administration is that the tax cuts that he put in place the first time he was in office, those are maintained, and that we actually don't have a tax increase on the average American. So that's all really serious. But within it, a lot of stuff has come out in terms of the green stuff, right? The green energy subsidies and the wind and solar. And I'm so opposed to the subsidies on wind and solar, and I'm pretty well opposed to wind and solar, and that is because they're extremely unreliable and intermittent forms of energy, and they're heavily subsidized. They're made with coal-fired power generation and forced labor in China, and they keep that price very, very low, so then they can dump it on the world market. And then, so we buy this cheap product, and then we shove it into our grid. We're subsidizing it, so the companies that are doing this, like Excel and others, are making lots of money, right? They're doing very well themselves. But once they put this into the grid, it increases the price of electricity dramatically. There's a direct correlation with adding wind and solar into your grid and increasing electricity prices. And that is particularly the case when you are the US or you are Europe, where you add wind and solar into a grid and you take off the reliable baseload power generation, often coal or nuclear, and then you really see an escalating price. So there's no place in the world where you do not see a rise in electricity prices when you add wind and solar into a grid. And that is because the wind does not always blow and the sun does not always shine. And I think it's really important to point out that if you are banking on climate change and you think we are going to have increase in rising temperatures and extreme weather, one, it's very hard to get that right? Are we actually going to, if you did everything to get to net zero, would you actually lower temperatures? Maybe not. And so the reality is that extreme weather temperatures doesn't really matter. If you are forecasting for higher temperatures and extreme cold or extreme anything, wind does not blow in extremely hot temperatures. Batteries do not work in extremely hot temperatures. They also don't work in extremely cold temperatures. And when it snows or it's cloudy, you don't get power generation from solar, nor do you get it at night. And so it's this intermittency and this non-dispatchable baseload power generation that's a problem, right? You can't easily dispatch it. When we're talking about natural gas, it's very energy dense, right? So it makes up, like, the power density between natural gas and wind is 1,000 to 1, because natural gas power generation to wind power generation, the power density is 1,000 to 1. So it's because the energy density of natural gas is so much. And the same thing with coal is that coal is just it's a reliable dispatchable baseload power generation. And so when you're decreasing that in the grid and you're adding that wind and solar, that's what's happening, right? These power purchase agreements that you're seeing all over the country, where they're buying the wind and solar, but once it gets and it's subsidized, that makes it easier on the power purchase agreement. Then it gets shoved into the grid, and then those electricity prices start going up, and the consumer and businesses are the ones that feel that. And that is really material because you cannot compete, you cannot build things, and you cannot heat or power your home or be a small business or make things, make earrings like this, which are made in China, annoyingly. You can't do that unless you have power generation. And so we have more natural gas and we have more coal than any nation in the entire world. And so we shouldn't be facing these rising and escalating electricity prices. And it is stuff that's in this bill, this wind and solar tax credits, that's so meaningful. So within the House bill, they basically put a provision in there to where if you have not got the wind and solar into the grid and it's providing power by 2027, then you don't get the tax credit. So Elon Musk is all in a tizzy about this, right? He is very upset about reducing the subsidies for electric vehicles because obviously his business relies upon that. I don't think we should be subsidizing expensive electric vehicles, Teslas, to anyone. If you want to buy a electric vehicle with a battery that comes from China from forced labor and coal-fired power generation, go do it. But do not feel good about yourself for doing it because you're not lowering emissions and you're certainly not doing anything humane for humans with forced labor or the environment. And we have there's just extreme supply chain issues with that. But importantly, it's the wind and solar. These. He also said that you are basically you're we are subsidizing old fuels and we are not investing in the new fuels of the future. And so I think that's what you're hearing a little bit. I listened to Bloomberg and CNBC to try to get some commentary, and that's what I'm hearing a little bit of people that are against this, right? Against these tax, ending these tax cuts and subsidies for wind and solar, is that you have a lot of folks saying, when Trump gets out of office, the Democrats are going to have to come in and they're going to have to invest heavily in wind and solar. Well, that's extremely inflationary because again, these are subsidized on the front end from China, but once it gets into the grid, it adds those costs, right? So we are already seeing that, and we have not put a lid on those escalating electricity prices as it is right now. So Elon Musk, he said in his tweet, and this was a couple days ago. He said the latest Senate draft bill will destroy millions of jobs in America and cause immense strategic harm to our country! Exclamation! Utterly insane and destructive. It gives handouts to industries of the past while severely damaging industries of the future. So it's not true. Industries of natural gas and oil are not of the past. They're going to be with us for a long, long time in the future and probably forever, particularly natural gas. And so I think it's just a disingenuous post. It's a disingenuous statement, and really just means we are not, if you have to subsidize wind and solar and everyone says it's the cheapest form of power, it's just not, right? It's heavily reliant on these subsidies. So though what happened last night was that there was an additional a tax on wind and solar added into the Senate bill. It was removed late last night before they passed it. And so it was a tax that if you had any foreign components, those from China, then it would be additionally taxed. And then if it wasn't in service by 2027 and providing electricity, then the subsidies were going to go away. So it's still really messy. It's very hard to get through all of this. There's a ton of stuff in here. It's complexly written. It's not super clear. And so it's an absolute mess. Now there's some great stuff within the bill. There's some, we do need to increase military spending. Yes, that it is increasing spending, but you have to increase the military spending to actually compete and stay ahead of the curve on this. And then there's some great stuff about, making sure we're investing in the strategic petroleum reserve and things like that. So there's some good stuff, but it's extremely messy right now. And so this wind and solar piece and this all this green energy tax credits and subsidies are a huge component because one, they're very expensive. These subsidies are expensive, and you have states, especially red states, that were given sort of these handouts during the Inflation Reduction Act that are actually pushing back on this because they want this money and they want these jobs. And interestingly enough, you did see over the weekend where Bud Brigham was in the Wall Street Journal along with Alex Epstein for going against the carbon sequestration tax credits and saying, basically the industry does not need to be relying, the oil and gas industry should not be relying on carbon sequestration. I very much agree with Bud Brigham here. Carbon sequestration, and I say this very clearly, if the oil and gas industry is trying to reduce emissions, one, it's ridiculous because the UN, the Paris Climate Accords, all these guys, they don't want the oil and gas industry production to reduce emissions. They want emissions reduced from the back end, the actual use, or scope 3 end user emissions. And so I think, yes, if you get tax credits, who doesn't want that? Who doesn't want this money? But the problem is that you're doing nothing to help the environment by sequestering carbon from the production side of the business. And if you want to do it and you want to increase output, that's great, right? If you want to increase your oil production by using carbon, to actually increase your oil production, I'm all for that. I don't think that should really be subsidized or the industry. And maybe you could give a tax credit or subsidization to help increase output in the name of national security and energy security. But in terms of just giving, purely I produce CO2 emissions and I shove it back into the ground, you should probably focus that directly on looking at a coal-fired power plant and just sequestering that carbon so that coal-fired power plant can keep on living and providing reliable and dispatchable baseload power. But if we're talking about the industry, it is 1% of US CO2 emissions comes from production of oil and gas. So it is a pretty ridiculous to go around saying and hand waving and green waving and virtue signaling to saying that you're reducing the carbon emissions. So that was a contentious. I encourage you to read the article within the Wall Street Journal. It's relatively contentious because folks like Continental Resources is named in here, as well as Vicky Hullab. I've mentioned this before, but Vicky Hullab has been seen in Europe at Davos, apologizing for basically producing oil and gas, and they are Occidental is a big component, a big company that actually is a big proponent of these tax credits for CCS, as well as actually doing more things on CCS and increasing output, and being the lowest carbon barrel output, which I'm not necessarily against that. But so all that's going on. There's a lot of pork, a lot of things happening, a lot of arguing, a lot of fighting, a lot of contestation with this. The stock market seems to think that this bill is going to pass. I think the Trump administration was hoping they would pass this by 4th of July. We'll see if this actually happens. This is extremely problematic, I think, on a number of fronts for all the stuff that's in it. But I just did a live stream with Steve Malloy and Jason Isaac for the American Energy Institute. And Steve Malloy was talking to the fact that, there are stuff by legislation, by strokes of a pen, that the president of the United States can actually extract or get rid of some of this green scam stuff that he calls it, green scam stuff, and get rid of this. So I'm not sure that's the case. If this bill passes, that they can just get rid of that. I think it's going to be more problematic. But more importantly, I think it's really, really important just to think about, when you subsidize this wind and solar power, you're allowing it to get into these power purchase agreements, and then you're forcing it into the grid, and then it's the consumer and the businesses and the manufacturer that is paying the rising electricity costs, and it is directly and inherently making the US less competitive. So, and I want the US to be very competitive. We are the largest oil and natural gas producer in the entire world. When I was looking at oil and gas production, so we're at 13.5 million barrels per day. We're at 130 billion cubic feet per day of gross withdrawals. That was as of March. I have not seen the latest updated number for April, but 130 BCF a day. That is an all-time record high. So just to put that in context, folks, that is over that that's 30 BCF more than a quarter of world's production and consumption. So roughly, supply and demand for natural gas in the world is 400 billion cubic feet per day, and we're producing 130 of that. That is just remarkable, and that is why this is not a peak business by any means, and also why we have so much natural gas, why we need to be using more in our electricity pool to power things, especially for AI, especially for just manufacturing, and also why we need to be exporting more, putting those molecules on the water and providing greater energy security. And also that provides greater domestic energy security because it keeps prices at a reasonable level in the US, and it provides greater global energy security because it allows folks not to be dependent on regional powers that pipe it, like Russia. So with that, folks, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this 4th of July special from PetroNerds, from me, Trisha Curtis, your host. This is a great time, guys, to get involved with PetroNerds. Become a client, sponsor the PetroNerds podcast. I've had folks do one-offs where we do short sponsorships. Efficient Markets, Energy Net is one of those. I also came in and gave them a talk and presentation to their company. So this is a great time to do that. There's a lot in the queue. I have done I have done recordings. Mike Howard, the CEO of Howard Energy Partners, a midstream company. He's the former president of Energy Transfer. I recorded that podcast a couple weeks ago. That's going to be dropping. The podcast, as I mentioned, with Matt Gallagher and Bud Brigham in Austin, where he gave a talk and presentation and had a bunch of industry leaders ask some really, really great questions on the business. That's going to be dropping as well. So there's just a lot in the queue. There's a lot happening around the world in geopolitics, in the economy. PetroNerds has you covered. Thank you guys so much for listening, and I'll talk to you soon, folks. Bye.